coming. If any of you have come to any of our earlier lectures, which I know a few of you had, you know that we've had much bigger crowds.
Yeah, we have.
But I have news for you. They don't know what they're missing. We're going to go out in a big way. I think tonight might be the best one yet. So thank you so much for being here. Hi, welcome. I'm just lamenting, we normally have a bigger crowd, and so we're very glad you're here. And you have great odds of winning a door prize. So there you go. So for those of you who have not yet met, my name is Denise Van Buren. I don't think you need to see. Why is that showing up here? You don't see it, but I see it on my screen here. There we go. My name is Denise Van Buren, and I'm the current president of the Beacon Historical Society. And I'd like to start out by thanking Two-Way Brewing for suggesting this 6-part series. This is the finale, and I hope you're going to enjoy it. As usual, for those of you who've come before, you know I talk a little too much, and I get off on tangents, and tonight will be no different, folks. So prepare yourself for it. This picture, for those of you who have asked me, is actually the Spring Street School in 1929. They were dressed for a Thanksgiving pageant that they were having. And I included that as my key slide because tonight's program is about a lot of famous Beaconites, but it's also about some everyday Beaconites, but people who really deserve to be remembered. And so I hope I won't go on too long. Please bear with me if I do. Who absconded with my slide border? There it is. Okay, I should also take just a moment to thank my wonderful husband, Chris Barkley, over here in the corner. Give him a round of applause. He comes, he helps me set up everything. Most of all, when I spend weekends working on the slideshows, he's very forgiving and very supportive of everything that I do. So, if you've come before, you know I start every slideshow the same way with a great big thank you. Come on now. It's turned on. It's got power. Okay, Chris, I think you know what your next job is. Sit over there and forward the slides. For some reason, it's not working. Battery, it must be dead in it. It's come on. Have I had one single night where everything worked? I don't think so. You're going to have to sit there and forward the slides. You can pull it over. Sit in that front seat.
It wasn't in the job description.
I know it. Front and center. Okay. For the ladies, I was telling them earlier. Oh, that's not good. Okay, that's good. Okay, you can hit enter. E-N-T-E-R. There you go. Okay. Yay! Okay. With a shout out to the famous Bob Murphy. Bob was our city historian, of course. He was our president for 20 years at the Historical Society. He wrote and edited our newsletter for an astounding 38 years. I wrote 2 books with him. He really was an encyclopedia of Beacon history. And I have actually edited a literal encyclopedia of Beacon history because I took his 38 years of newsletters and put them together in one volume. There's a display copy over on the table, but I'm happy to say that I sold already the other 2 copies that I brought. But if you're looking for a great gift for the holidays, maybe for a newcomer in your neighborhood or a family member who doesn't live in Beacon anymore, just email me, beaconhistoricalsociety@gmail. If you live here in town, I'm more than happy to deliver them to you. And I also want to credit Bob for the outstanding growth of our collection and our society under his tenure. So this is a presentation about well-known but also about lesser-known people. I'm going to break it into section with a few Beaconites to illustrate that section, each category. These are, for the most part, people who lived here or who had a lasting impact here, not just someone who visited. We had a lot of people, a lot of famous people who came through and visited in Beacon, but that's not what tonight is about. This is actually about Beaconites, and I do hope to honor some everyday people along the way. And I should have noted, if you want to go out and get a beer, please feel free to. The bar is open the whole time, and we won't take any kind of break, so it'd just be easiest if you went out and got your own. Hi, welcome. Thank you so much for coming in. Come on in. We're just getting started. Come on, Maxine. Come on, John. I ask all those hard questions, and my friend John Hopper can answer all of them. Let him get acclimated here. That'll do it. Welcome. There's some seats back here, and I'll before we draw our door prizes tonight, I'll get those of you who came in a little bit later some door prize tickets. So as I was saying, it's a presentation about the more famous names that you will recognize, maybe stories you don't know, but these people were famous in their day. But also I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the everyday people. These are people who went before us, who we should remember what they did and the legacy that they left here in Beacon. And again, it's kind of a long presentation, but it's my big finale with these. We're going to start with indigenous people and our earliest settlers. And of course, with that, we start with Chief Nimham. It's a sculpture that you may recognize in the town of Fishkill. He was the last sachem of the Wappinger people who were here where we are tonight. In fact, their territory really expanded all the way from Manhattan up to Columbia County on this side of the river. What you may not know about him is that he was an American Revolutionary War combat. He died in combat. He was a patriot on the American side. But his story is just amazing. He was born out in Wikipe near where the Brinkerhoff area is. He learned to speak English, and he disputes the colonist land claims on his tribal lands. He goes to England in the 1760s and pleads his case before the court that his property rights should be returned to him. Even though he is unsuccessful in that fight, he comes back and he fights on the side of the Americans. He and his son, Daniel and Abraham, and fellow Stockbridge warriors are going to fight for the Americans on our side. They serve with Washington at Valley Forge. They're with the Marquis de Lafayette's troops. They're at Saratoga in the fall of 1777. And regrettably, on August the 31st, 1778, these 50 Stockbridge militia, led by Nimham, are attacked by a loyalist unit down in the Bronx. And all of them are wiped out, including Daniel and Abraham. So he dies in service to this new nation. And I want to invite all of you, our next November meeting, our monthly meeting for the Beacon Historical Society will be held at the Elks Club on the Tuesday after Thanksgiving. And we have someone from New York State Parks who's coming to give a presentation on the life of Daniel Nimham. It's really significant, and everybody's welcome to come to those. So 7 o'clock on the 28th at the Elks. He was a contemporary of, this is the universal signal for next one, honey, thank you. Of Madam Brett, I'm not paying him enough for this, he says. Of Madam Brett, whose home I hope you recognize, standing here is the oldest building in Dutchess County, right here in the city of Beacon. She and her husband, Roger, come here about 1708, 1709. He's killed shortly thereafter. She stays here in the wilderness, a mother of 3 sons, and she has inherited about 28,000 acres of land, okay? Not only all of Beacon, but Fishkill and East Fishkill, all the way out to the Connecticut line. She inherited about a third of the Rombau patent. The Melzinga chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution saved her home in 1954 when it was going to be torn down to put the old A&P supermarket on the site, and they've operated it as a museum ever since. So if you've never been there, oldest building in Dutchess County, an inspiring women's story at a time when too few women's stories and contributions to history were recorded. Please go visit the Madam Brett homestead. She was widowed when she was only 31 years old, and she stayed here for the rest of her life. She's buried, anybody know where she's buried? You know, the great Dutch Reformed Church in the village of Fishkill? She's buried beneath the pulpit. Only because the church was smaller originally. She's buried in the cemetery. They expand the church and they put the pulpit right over where her grave is. So other early important settlers here, I'm sorry the quality of this is not great, includes John Peter DeWint, who you see on the left, and his wife on the right. He creates what some of you may remember as Long Dock or Long Wharf. He's a very successful trader. He comes from the British Isle of Eustatia in the Caribbean when he comes here. Very well-to-do when he comes here. He comes in 1815. The year before, he had married Caroline Amelia Smith. She is the granddaughter of, for those of you who attended my other presentations, President Adams. So that's his granddaughter there. They have 10 children. 10 of their children, out of 11 survived to adulthood, and they have this fabulous home which was lost to fire in the 1850s right north of where the train station is. And it was a huge, huge home, and it was kind of an epicenter for culture here in the Hudson River Valley. It's where the Marquis de Lafayette is going to come to visit. And everyone who was anyone visited them at Cedar Grove was the name of their home. And so these are important people in the history of Beacon. Let's move on now to the arts and entertainment world. I'm going to start with an artist named Alice Judson. Go ahead. There she is. This is one of her paintings. She specialized in landscapes of Dutchess County and seascapes of Gloucester, Mass. She was born here in the village of Madiwan. She studied with her friend Caroline Mays at the Art Students League of New York. The two of them make frequent trips to Europe, mainly Paris, in the early 20th century. She's also an instructor at the Pittsburgh School of Art. She had a studio here on Tioronda Avenue in the old Minuteman Construction building. That was where her art studio was. And she had an art studio in New York City for 30 years. She dies in 1948. She's buried at St. Luke's Episcopal Church Cemetery here. We just acquired through an eBay auction this painting of hers from the 1920s. Anybody recognize where it's from? Denny, you can't answer.
No.
Yes. Water Street, bingo, bingo. Every one of the structures that you see here is still here, right? So this is the McMillan building across the street. They're all still here. These two homes are here. This is the back of Dogwood or whatever it's now going to be in its next incarnation.
I'm over that.
Okay, so you can see this came from an estate in Delmar. At one point, Alice Judson is the painting instructor at Emma Willard School, which was a very exclusive school in Troy, New York. And so this came from an estate out of Guilderland, New York, and ends up somehow down in Florida, and we bought it through eBay. At one point, it was framed and matted differently. You see here? This is the original blue, and this is what happened when it was exposed, and it's dirty. We have it now over in Williamstown, Massachusetts, being professionally restored. And I mentioned that she had a good friend, Caroline Mays. Her father was Willard Mays from the hat shop. And we also brought over one of her works. This is her view of Newburgh. It's a chalk. It's done in chalk, and that hopefully is being restored as well. Caroline Mays, also born in Madiwan, best known for Impressionist landscapes. When these two women go to France, they study painting and are influenced by the Impressionists such as Renoir, Manet, and Monet. Just like Alice Judson, she dies in 1948, and the two of them are both buried in St. Luke's Cemetery here. Really well-respected and collected artists right here from the village of Madiwan. Now, the entertainment part of it, I want to start with this man, Isaac van Amberg, who was born in Fishkill Landing in 1808. You probably don't recognize the name, right? He's an American animal trainer who developed the first trained animal act. He's credited with being the first man to ever put his head into the mouth of a lion. On July 7th, 1838, the New York Mirror described Van Amberg's, quote, fearless acts of placing his bare arm moist with blood in the lion's mouth and thrusting his head into the distended jaws of a tiger. By age 23, Isaac van Amberg was traveling the world. He was in England, actually. He had the largest traveling show in England. It featured several animals, tigers, leopards, lambs, lions, and he performs for Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. In fact, the Queen commissioned the artist Edwin Landseer to paint this portrait of Van Amberg. In 1839, Queen Victoria traveled 6 times in 6 months just to see his program. He dies in 1865 at the age of just 54 of a heart attack. I wonder why. But he did, and he was world famous. He was very well to do, and unfortunately, and I'm not sure why, he's buried in Newburgh. He is not buried in Beacon. I hope you recognize Robert Montgomery, movie star, actor, director, producer, born in Fishkill Landing. His father was president of the New York Rubber Company, and regrettably, he died by suicide. When the firm experienced some financial difficulties, he jumped off the Brooklyn Bridge. Young Robert begins his acting career on stage shortly thereafter, but then he's hired by MGM. He's initially assigned roles in comedies, but soon he proves that he can handle some dramatic roles too. Have any of you ever seen him in a movie? Okay. If you want to look one up, he plays this terrifyingly psychotic man named Danny in a movie called Night Must Fall from 1937. It's really good. You should look for it. And Joe the Boxer, Mistakenly Sent to Heaven, and Here Comes Mr. Jordan. That was from 41. Both of those earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. During World War II, he leaves Hollywood to drive ambulances in France, and after the Dunkirk invasion, he actually enlists in the Navy, and he's present at Normandy. He comes back to Hollywood and has a whole nother career for himself. In 1948, he hosts the Academy Awards. He also hosted an Emmy Award-winning television series, Robert Montgomery Presents, which ran from 50 to 57. In 1954, though, he leaves Hollywood, and he goes to Washington, D.C. as an unpaid consultant and coach to President Eisenhower. He advises him how to look his best on television and how to make appearances before the nation. So he's kind of a pioneering media consultant. He has an office in the White House beginning in 1954. And if you're ever out in Hollywood, he has not one but two stars on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. One is for his movie work and the other is for his television work. But you probably all know him as the father of...
Elizabeth Montgomery.
Don't leave us in suspense, Chris. There you go. There she is. Okay. Elizabeth Montgomery, Bewitched, right? So every time you see Bewitched, I want you to think her grandparents and her father was born here in Fishkill Landing. Kind of neat, right? Okay, now this next actor may not be too familiar to you. I'm talking about the gentleman with the mustache in the middle. His name is Harold Weinberger. He was born in Beacon, and his official titles at MGM were assistant director and production manager, but he would often fill in as a bit player, so you have to really look for him and know who you're looking for. He's seen here as a prison guard wearing a fake mustache between Clark Gable and Joan Crawford in a 1940 film. Weinberger attended the Fishkill Landing Grammar School, later called, of course, South Avenue School, and he graduated from Beacon High School. He grew up on Beekman Street, raised by his mother and his stepfather. After his MGM years, he becomes an assistant director in television, working on programs like Gomer Pyle and That Girl. So look for him. His name again is Harold Weinberger, and he had two R's in Harold. It was kind of unique. His real life experiences were like a Hollywood movie script. At 16, he argued with his stepfather, and he left home in Beacon and joined the Canadian Navy, lying about his age. He was discharged and joined the Canadian Army when they found out how old he was. And when he's over in France in World War I, he's gassed. But he returns in World War II. He goes back to Hollywood. He returns in World War II to join the Marines as a combat photographer. He's at the Battle of Iwo Jima, where he's wounded with shrapnel. And for his heroism in that battle, he was awarded the Bronze Star. After duty in Korea, he retired from the Marines with the rank of major and was believed to be the oldest U.S. Marine. So just kind of a neat thing, right? And you wouldn't even know that he was here from Beacon. So yes?
Is he an American Marine or Canadian?
He was, I think he was, after World War I, he enlisted in World War II.
Oh.
And so he gets that at World War II. So he's a U.S. Marine. He's a U.S. Marine. So first, initially, he's too young to get to the U.S. Marines. He goes to Canada and joins. But after World War II, he serves in the U.S. forces. Okay, moving on. And Chris, I'm only teasing you. Thank you for being such a good sport. You may or may not recognize him, Jimmy Grippo. He was born in Italy, but he grew up here in Beacon. He considers it his hometown. He's the house magician at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas, starting in 1966 when it opened, and he continued to work there for 20 years. He was Emilio Bettina's manager, who we'll talk about in just a moment, and it was said that he hypnotized him into winning the light heavyweight championship, as well as many other successful careers and life changes for other people. He was known as a lay hypnotist and a professional magician who was inducted into the Society of American Magicians Hall of Fame. He was the official host of Las Vegas in the 1970s and of Caesar's Palace Hotel and Casino from the late 60s till he died in 1992. On the right is his brother Jan Grippo. Can't you see them at holidays just doing this to each other, right? Who was born actually here in Beacon in 1906. Okay, his brother was 1898 in Italy, so the family comes here to Beacon between that time. He goes on to produce about 50 Bowery Boy movies in Hollywood, as well as co-produce the Valentino story. He was the founder of something, I'm not a Las Vegas person, but they tell me there's something called the Magic Castle in Hollywood. It's a private club for magicians, and he's one of the founders of it. And he died in 1988. This gentleman is Paul LaValle, born Joseph Yusufer. Here in 1908, Yusufer is a common name, right? He was a conductor, a composer, an arranger, a performer on both the clarinet and the saxophone. His parents were Ralph and Jenny Yusufer, both of whom were Italian immigrants. He graduates from Beacon High School, and he intends to study at Columbia Law. But lo and behold, he gets a scholarship to Juilliard, and so he goes there instead. And he goes on to perform in these really popular 1930s bands. In 1933, he becomes an arranger and a clarinetist for the NBC House Orchestra. This is in the great era of radio, right? When they're playing all these musical soundtracks. He works on radio programs, including the Dinah Shore Show. He has his own radio show where he collaborates with artists like Victor Borge and Mario Lanza. In 1940, the New York Times described him as, quote, NBC's ubiquitous music maker. He told a reporter, quote, music is my life, and I am happy that it is so. He was selected over several applicants to become the conductor of the Band of America in 1948. They performed on the weekly radio program on NBC for 8 years. Each program began with this introduction: 48 states, 48 stars, 48 men marching down the main street of everybody's hometown. Here comes the Band of America, conducted by Paul LaValle. In 1949, he becomes one of the first bands to ever appear weekly on television, and then he begins to take over in 1964 the Band of America, which performs at the World's Fair and other places. He guest conducts the ABC Symphony, the CBS Symphony, the NBC Symphony, the New York Philharmonic, and the Rochester Philharmonic. In 1966, he becomes the conductor for the Radio City Music Hall Orchestra. So if you search YouTube for him, and any local want to tell me, is it LaValle or Laval?
I think it's LaValle.
Laval, okay. Paul Laval, if you search for him on YouTube, there's tons of his recordings. And he was really, really famous in his day. As was, this isn't going to help me, this gentleman, Tony Acquaviva. Is that name familiar to anybody from Beacon? He's born here in 1925. He, too, is an American composer, conductor, a string instrumentalist, and he was the founder of the New York Pop Symphony Orchestra. Believe it or not, he graduated from West Point. And he served in the Army's orchestral division from 1944 to 48. But he gains national fame in the music world as a clarinetist, and just like Laval, he is a band leader and an orchestra conductor, recording artist, but he also happens to marry a big celebrity of the time. Her name was Joni James. Did somebody just say Joni James? You knew that. We got an insider, a ringer over here tonight.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. Both Tony and his brother Nick, a noted professional musician in his own right, became interested in music right here in Beacon at a very young age. Their father was Mike Acquaviva, and he ran a barber shop at 422 Main Street. And of course, everybody knows the legendary Pete Seeger. Folk singer, social activist. He had a string of hit records beginning in the early 50s as a member of the Weavers, notably their recording of Goodnight Irene, which topped the charts for 13 weeks in 1950. What a different time, right? Members of the Weavers were blacklisted during the McCarthy era. In the 1960s, Seeger reemerged on the public scene as a prominent singer of protest music. We know that, right? His best-known songs that he wrote were Where Have All the Flowers Gone?, If I Had a Hammer, Kisses Sweeter Than Wine, and Turn, 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 which have been recorded by many other artists. He and Toshi purchased their land on the top of the mountain in 1949. They lived first in a trailer, and then they built a log cabin that they live in. He was the founder, as many of us know, of the Beacon Sloop Club, and he was also a very active member of the Beacon Historical Society. Would often come to our meetings. One year showed up at the Christmas party with Arlo Guthrie in tow and played for us as we sang Christmas music. Yeah. So I just want to tell you one little quick story about the picture on the right. In November of 1965, he performed a benefit concert at Beacon High to benefit the Beacon Teacher Association's Scholarship Loan Fund. Didn't go so well, the proposal. A few weeks earlier, he had just performed at Russia's Moscow University and had sung a few anti-war songs, and some local feelings were also still a little bit raw because he had failed to testify at the House Committee investigating communism. So here in Beacon, a local committee of 12 fraternal and religious organizations got together to stop the concert. The Board of Education came under fire for allowing this controversial figure to perform at the school. On the night of the concert, which was November 27, 1965, our police chief, Sam Wood, and 5 of his officers patrolled the gymnasium to keep order, but there wasn't any need because there was no protest at all. The gym was filled to capacity with everybody from senior citizens to elementary school children. He sang for 2 hours, 25 songs in all, including Old Dutchess Junction, sung to the tune of Red River Valley. And amazingly, the concert raises $3,000 for the scholarship fund because he donated his services. So that was a lot of money back in 1965. Toshi dies here in Beacon on July the 9th, 2013 at the age of 91. And Pete dies down at New York Presbyterian Hospital in 2014, and he was 94. So they both lived very long lives. Now, this next gentleman I doubt you're going to recognize him. You'll really surprise me if you do. But you're going to recognize his work. His name is Howard Ashman, and back in 1989, he rented a house down on Slocum Road, 791 Slocum Road. He lived there for 2 years while he was awaiting construction of his home, which was being built down in Cold Spring. But regrettably, he's going to die in March of 1991, and he never gets to see that new home. So who was he? Well, just like the other musicians and lyricists that we talked about before, he was a prolific musical lyricist and producer who first came to prominence in 1982 with a work that he conceived and wrote and directed with music by Alan Menken called Little Shop of Horrors. Ashman was soon pivotal in the renaissance of Disney animated musicals and the development of The Little Mermaid. He was producer and did all the lyrics for Little Mermaid. Beauty and the Beast, executive producer, did all the lyrics. And Aladdin did all the lyrics, music by Alan Menken. While living here in Beacon during the production of The Little Mermaid, he discovered he was infected with HIV. Despite his illness, he continues to work, giving life here in Beacon to Beauty and the Beast, here in our city. Disney, in fact, set up a special studio workspace for all of his co-workers in a conference room at the Residence Inn in Fishkill on Route 9. It's not a Residence Inn anymore. The rest of his team, including Alan Menken, fly in. They go to work creating some of the most beloved and recognizable Disney music that we know. The musical team was so impressed by the customer service at the Residence Inn in Fishkill, New York, that they were inspired to write a song called Be Our Guest. Be Our Guest, yes. All from here in Beacon and Fishkill. Isn't that astounding? Next time you watch Beauty and the Beast, if you have grandchildren like we do, his co-workers all dedicated Beauty and the Beast in his memory. It says, to our friend Howard, who gave a mermaid her voice and a beast his soul, he will be forever missed. So now we have this connection to those musicals. I just think that's wonderful. So let's talk a little bit about some of our athletes. Beacon's Emilio Bettina won victory over Tiger Jack Fox for the world light heavyweight title in 1939. It was a huge, huge night for Beacon. Hi, welcome. Hi. You missed some great ones already, but we got a lot to go. 2,000 people from the city of Beacon rode what was called the Bettina Special down to New York City. February the 3rd. Our Chandler Drum and Bugle Corps leads the way as the crowd leaves Grand Central Station, walking down the middle of the streets. The newspaper said, quote, sweeping away taxis, buses, cars, even unwary pedestrians, up Broadway to Madison Square Garden. At the arena, the band marches around the ring, playing a lively tune. Hats are flying in the air and confetti is flying everywhere. So here's just a little bit about the bout itself. He was fighting Tiger Jack Fox of Spokane, Washington, and Fox was an 11-5 favorite to beat Emilio. The fight was broadcast live nationwide at 10 o'clock that night over NBC. At 1 minute and 22 seconds into the 9th round, Emilio wins the fight. He tames the tiger. Referee Eddie Joseph stops it. Emilio Bettina is the new lightweight heavyweight champion of the world. His mother, who dislikes boxing, refuses to go to the fight. But his parents are listening to the radio, and they hear their son say at the end of it, quote, I am glad I won. Hello, Ma. Hello, Pa. Emilio was inducted into the World Boxing Weight Hall of Fame in Los Angeles on October the 14th, 1995. He dies the next year, and he's buried in St. Joachim Cemetery. Elmer Steele was the first baseball player from Beacon to make the climb to the major leagues. Steele, who was born in 1886, had a modest 5-year career, but it was in the majors. He pitched 2 years for the Red Sox, 2 years for Pittsburgh, and his final year for the Brooklyn Dodgers. Besides pitching locally for Tompkins Hose Company, in his youth he played for the Ducks. And the Ducks was a local ball club whose field was where, today, we know, Dia, right? It had previously, been before it was obviously Nabisco, but National Biscuit. Before that, it was a baseball field, and it was called the Ducks Field. The 1911 city directory for Fishkill Landing reads, quote, Elmer Steele of 16 South Cedar Street, baseball player. He was born in Peekskill, but he had moved to Fishkill Landing to find work and to play ball. It was not uncommon for the factories to hire workers because they were good ball players, because they wanted them for their interleague teams here. After his pro career, he actually moved to Poughkeepsie, umpired for a long time there. He played ball into his 50s. We'd be remiss if we didn't talk about Richard Digger Phelps, who was born on the 4th of July. In 1941, a former college basketball coach, most notably of Notre Dame. From 1971 to 91, for 20 years, from 1993 to 2014, he was an analyst on ESPN. During his 20 seasons, his Notre Dame teams went 393 to 197 with 14 seasons of 20 wins or more. He shares the NCAA record for most upsets over a number one team at 7 with Gary Williams. After he retires from Notre Dame, Digger briefly works at the National Office of Drug Control Policy in the administration of George H.W. Bush. And of course, we all know, because we're all so smart, where he got his name, right? Because his father was the mortician, was the undertaker. And a little more current day, we do have 2 recent standout athletes I want to tell you about. Elijah Hughes, who started playing basketball in our little local CYO system. Following his 8th grade basketball season, he's called up to varsity at Beacon High, and after 2 years, he's going to transfer to John F. Kennedy with hopes of receiving some more exposure. He was selected as the 39th pick in the second round of the 2020 NBA draft by the New Orleans Pelicans. His draft rights were traded to the Utah Jazz, who assigned him to the Salt Lake City Stars of the NBA G League. In February of last year, Hughes was traded to the Portland Trail Blazers in a 3-team trade. He's now, I believe, with the Wisconsin Herd, although he later did sign with the Turkish team and the Milwaukee Bucks. And then on the right is Lenny Torres, a professional baseball pitcher in the Cleveland Guardians Association. He graduated from Beacon High, where, of course, he played baseball. Between his junior and senior years, USA Baseball chose him for their 18 and under nationwide team. He did play some college ball at St. John's University. Now we'll talk a little bit about some noted authors. Let's start with 2 women who lived here briefly, temporarily. On the left is the authoress of The Secret Garden, Frances Hodgson Burnett. She often stayed and wrote in Beacon. In fact, at the time, she was staying at Fishkill Landing in a home on Ferry Street when she wrote the book, The Secret Garden. So if you like that book, it was primarily written here in Beacon. She's most widely known for her book, Little Lord Fauntleroy. She came to Beacon as early as 1902. Her biographer, Gretchen Gerzina, writes that Frances Burnett at the time, this is back in 1902, needed peace and quiet, but right now was distracted by pain. She was seeing Dr. William Whittle, who had diagnosed her as suffering from neuritis or nerve inflammation, and decided to send her to a rest home, Riverview Sanitarium in Fishkill Landing. There she received constant care for physical deterioration, but her mind and spirits once again flourished. After 6 weeks at the sanitarium, she was able to go for walks, and she resumed writing. And so the book, The Secret Garden, is written here, where she's going to recuperate and write it here, which is pretty amazing if you ask me. Another authoress that no, you can go back one, honey, I'm sorry, that I'd like to mention, don't worry about it, you saw her briefly, Margaret Fuller, who was the first woman reporter for the New York Tribune, a devoted women's advocate. She wrote her most important book while she's staying here in Beacon in 1844. A writer, an educator, a journalist, and a colleague of Emerson and Thoreau, Margaret Fuller was an early women's rights advocate who came to Fishkill Landing in 1844 to begin writing her seminal work while she was staying at the Van Vliet boarding house, then located on Lower Main Street. And then that brings us to this fellow, who some of you may recognize, James Patterson, best-selling mystery writer, Kissed the Girls, and Along Came a Spider. Go ahead, honey. Let's look at this picture, though. Back row, 2 from the left. There he is, playing CYO, St. John's CYO, county champions that year, 1963. His mother, Isabel, taught in the lower grades at St. John's at the time. The family was living in Newburgh, but they moved to Beacon when Jim was a freshman at St. Patrick's High School across the river. He was there. They lived here in 1962 to 1965. Anybody remember Bob Cahill? He was the coach for the team. Can you see him there? During the time the Pattersons, for those 4 years, 1962 to 1965, lived at number 46 Vine Street. Then they later moved to Dutchess Terrace. He now has homes in Palm Beach, Florida, and Briarcliff Manor. When we got this picture, we wrote to him, and he came back with a fun little repartee about how he believed he was the best player on the team and some other fun things. But at the time, he also wrote and said, that he comes to Beacon and he drives around whenever he's here in the area because it brings back a lot of happy memories for him, and that he's proud to be a Beaconite. So, all right. And then our next author is Patricia Schultz, who of course is the authoress of the best-selling, New York Times best-selling book, 1,000 Places to Visit Before You Die. She said, quote, "I had a lovely childhood, but it wasn't quite enough for me." 1,000 Places to See Before You Die is the result of her wanderlust. Her parents were Leonard and Mary Ferrone Schultz. She grew up on North Walnut Street in a house that remains in the family. She attended St. John the Evangelist for grade school, and then she went across the river every morning to Mount St. Mary High School in Newburgh before heading off to Georgetown for her college degree. She was a travel writer for Frommer's and American Express before releasing her book, which has now been translated into 26 languages and made into a series for the Discovery Channel. And she has very generously given us not one, but 2 copies for our door prizes tonight that are signed and autographed by her that says how she's proud to be a Beaconite as well. So that's going to be our door prize. Patricia Schultz, we're very, very proud of her. Our next segment is some business leaders, and I'm going to start. You can't go to a presentation with me without a good headstone scene in it. So just going to show a couple representative investors who brought industry here and helped to provide for the economic engine that sustained our economy and therefore our community for generations. On the left, you see the grave of Peter A. Schenck. You have to keep them all stacked up neatly, these Schenks. His nephew was Peter H. Schenck, who you see down here. And then there's Philip Hone, is the fellow on the top right, and John Jacob Astor on the bottom, and I'm going to tell you how they all knit together in the history of Beacon. The Mattawan Manufacturing Company was our first cotton mill. It was essentially where 1 East Main Street was and where the Roundhouse area is. And if you attended the earlier presentation, you have a greater appreciation, I hope, for the Mattawan Manufacturing Company and what it meant to us here. It was erected by Peter A. Schenck, the cemetery, and his partner, Philip Hone. He's on the upper right. He was the one-time mayor of New York City in 1814. He was a leading citizen of New York City at the time, and he invests with Peter A. Schenck in our first factory. The next big project here in Beacon was the Glenham Mill, which is located on the site of the Texaco Research Center for most of us that know it. It begins in 1821 with the Glenham Company, and among its first shareholders are Peter H. Schenck, who's down on the bottom. He's the nephew of Peter A. Schenck. But his shareholders were, again, Philip Hone and also John Jacob Astor, the New York millionaire. So he's going to own property here. I think that's significant. By the middle of the 19th century, the properties, which by then include the Groville mill site, are worth about $1 million. So this is 1850s. That's about $40 million today. And you have people like John Jacob Astor who are the owners of it. It was considered the nation's 4th largest woolen mill at the time. In coming years, of course, the Glenham Mills would be noted for its production of blue woolen uniforms for the Union Army. Those factories and so much more here really, in that Roundhouse area, owes their genesis to men like these, including this gentleman, A.T. Stewart. He invested here. He built a carpet factory at Groville. So the original buildings that you see, that I think many of them are near there, being turned into living units, right, or have been already. The Glenham Carpet Mill cost about $1.5 million when it was built. That's about $50 million today. He also built all those workers' houses that you see off of Fishkill Avenue now for about 30 workers there in 1876. He was an extraordinary business person, A.T. Stewart. You could do a whole presentation on him and not even begin to cover it. He had a large marble-fronted store on Broadway. He built a new store covering an entire city block between Broadway and 4th Avenue. When a study was done in 2012, his business success was estimated to have made him one of the 20 wealthiest people in history. Wow. Not at the time, in history. He had a fortune equivalent at the time to $90 billion. And where did he invest? Right here in Beacon, right? Providing jobs and local tax support. Meet Oliver and Catherine Walcott. His grandfather was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was a general in the colonial forces in the Revolutionary War. His uncle was the governor of Connecticut and Secretary of the Treasury under Washington. This is Charles Walcott, after whom Walcott Avenue is named. You all recognize that, right? Lived on a grand estate, God bless you, not far from Walcott Avenue, called Roseneath, after all the beautiful gardens that he planted. He never really attained the stature that his more illustrious grandfather had, but he does become a very important, they're They're well-to-do people. He marries the Rankins, who are also well-to-do, and they have a controlling interest in the New York Rubber Company, which is one of the most successful manufacturing operations in the state of New York at the time. One claim to fame that Charles Walcott does have is that he at one time meets President Lincoln. He sends a letter home July 9th, 1861 to his wife, who's living at Roseneath, and he says, "Dear Kate, I have just returned from the White House, and there shook Mr. Lincoln by the hand and made my bow to his lady. I was introduced to Secretary Chase, Wells, and Seward, and I saw and was introduced to various other distinguished personages as well." So, pretty heady stuff for a little tiny community on the Hudson River, right? On the right is their only child, Catherine Walcott. She's going to marry a Verplanck. She's very active here in Beacon. During World War I, she will lead the Red Cross efforts here. She founds the DAR chapter in 1896. She's the first woman elected to the school board. She's really just a remarkable person and a civic leader in her own right. She does not have any children of her own. I love this mustached pair. Do you love them? They don't go together. They have nothing to do with each other, but I put them on the same slide because I love their stashes. On the left is Lewis Tompkins, a name that you might know. 1894, the Fishkill Standard newspaper says, "The man whose name will forever be cherished here." Of course, we know them as the fire company that still has that honor. And there's Tompkins Avenue is named after him. He'd established his Duchess Hat Works in Fishkill Landing, and he then begins to buy and build homes all around what we know as kind of the waterfront community. His house was Edgewater, which if you know where the new apartments are being built, his big mansion lived there. But he's going to build the homes and lay out the streets in like High Street, right next to us, Bank Street, West Church, Duchess Terrace, Mackin, Tompkins Avenues, all developed by him. All of the home sites are going to come. He names one street after his son, Ralph. But it's because of the fact that he's going to bring the hat manufacturing industry here to Fishkill Landing and Mattawan. His three operations, Duchess Hat, Tyrone, and Hudson Straw, from the 1870s onward, are going to employ thousands of people here in the manufacture of hats. He's really the person that, when you think of us being the hat capital of New York State, second nationally only to Danbury, Connecticut, Lewis Tompkins and that mustache. Soak up the real beauty of it there, will you? That mustache, that's who you're going to think of. On the right is a man named Weldon Weston, not as famous. He doesn't have a fire company name for him. But along with his brother Wilbur, he's going to run a stage line between Fishkill Landing and Mattawan from the 1870s right up until this trolley car comes in the 1890s. These two brothers are originally from New Hampshire. They are going to become the prime movers in a little operation called the Mount Beacon Incline Railway. So Wilbur, who you see here, was, excuse me, this is Weldon. Wilbur was the brother, was the president of the newly formed Central Hudson Steamboat Company of Newburgh. They owned the Odell and the Ramsdale, as well as 7 other passenger and freight steamers. But Weldon, seen here, was the president of the local board of trade. He remains in the livery business and the freighting business, but he's a major stockholder in the Mount Beacon Incline Association, and he's its treasurer and secretary. So he's really one of 2 people who are going to bring that Mount Beacon Incline Railway to our community. So lacking a better, less sexist term, I came up with statesman. I don't know if statespeople worked or not, so bear with me while I just talk about some elected officials. Have to begin with Alexander Hamilton, who's going to live on what we know as Denning's Point during several months during the American Revolution. At the time, it's called DePeyster's Point because the DePeyster's house is there. Hamilton is actually renting that while George Washington is where? Across the river in Newburgh, right? There are Hamilton letters that are held within the Vassar College Library, and Jim Herron, some of you may know Jim, found a half dozen or so written by Hamilton from DePeyster Point in the spring of 1781. It's a critical time in Hamilton's life because he's been an aide de camp and an assistant to General Washington, right? And he wants more than that. He wants a battlefield commission, which he ultimately gets, and of course he's at Yorktown when we actually win the American Revolution. But he's very frustrated because he wants more, and maybe we believe that some of the correspondence may have been written here when he's writing to Washington, actually saying he's going to give up his entire commission if he's not allowed to have a battlefield commission. You may know, of course, if you follow the musical, that he's married to Eliza. She's General Schuyler's daughter, and they live right up the river in Albany, and so it's a place that's going to be convenient for him to live here. Another gentleman who has forever a connection to Beacon was Colonel William Few. He's actually born in Maryland. He serves as lieutenant governor of the Georgia militia during the Revolution. He's a farmer and a self-educated lawyer. He's going to serve as a representative in the Georgia General Assembly for 4 terms. But importantly, this Colonel William Few is going to sign the U.S. Constitution for the state of Georgia in 1789. He would then serve 2 terms as a senator from Georgia. He helps to found the University of Georgia in 1785, but 1799, he's rebuffed for a political appointment that he wants, and he writes in his diary that he is humiliated, and he left, quote, the scorching climate of Georgia under all the accumulating evils of fevers and Negro slavery, those enemies of human felicity. So he's an abolitionist as well. He chooses New York City as his new home, and he comes to serve in our state assembly. He becomes the inspector for New York State prisons, the 8th alderman in the city of New York. And where is he going to retire to in 1815? Here in Fishkill Landing, in what we know as the Christie House on South Avenue. If you know, it's a B&B now. His son-in-law was Albert Christie, so his daughter is going to live with him there in Albert Christie's house. His grave, he gets buried in that Dutch Reformed church, which everybody here is concerned about, right? That's in such bad shape. His grave goes missing, and historians, particularly those from Georgia, are looking frantically, where is Colonel Few buried? Well, in 1939, a silver casket plate labeled William Few, died the 16th day of July, 1828, in the 80th year of his age, is found outside a vault there. Well, in the 1960s, high school teacher George Hughes seeks help for the historic graveyard. Everybody that's new to Beacon wants to come to us and say, how can we restore the graveyard? And I say, we've been trying to do that since the 1930s. Now they've sold the church. The parish, the congregation is just too small and can't afford it. But by 1967, this Beacon High School teacher, his letters finally start to make traction down there in Georgia, and they decide they're going to come up and they're going to retrieve Few's remains. With the National Bicentennial coming, they recognize an opportunity to bring this important figure who they finally found back to Georgia, even though he said he never wanted to go back to Georgia. He had been rebuffed for that position. But there's a little-known Georgia governor who's adamant that his body comes back, and that Georgia governor was?
Jimmy Carter.
Jimmy Carter. Good. So January of 1973, Beacon Funeral Home director Dick Phelps, work with me, right? Digger Phelps, right? So Digger Phelps' father, January 1973, leads a delegation through fresh snow to disinter Colonel Few's remains that are in this vault there, and they're going to transport those remains south in a small flag-draped coffin aboard Governor Carter's private plane. A fitting monument is constructed and formal ceremonies are held in Augusta, Georgia, where Few was remembered, quote, as an outstanding example of a good citizen, a patriot, and an American. Now, another Beaconite who would also fall into that category of an outstanding example of a good citizen, a patriot, and an American is none other than James Forrestal. Let me take you back to June 23, 1940. He's a Beacon native, as most of us know, born in Mattawan. He's going to leave his very lucrative career as an investment banker with a company called Dillon Reed and Company, and he's going to move to Washington to work for the Roosevelt administration. His title would be Administrative Assistant to the President, and his job was to advise FDR on financial matters. His motives to leave New York are both patriotic and altruistic. As the Beacon News reported, he left a $180,000 a year job to take a $10,000 a year government job. He had been a Navy aviator in World War I. He becomes Undersecretary of the Navy, a position that he would hold for 4 years before he would be named our nation's first Secretary of Defense. Crediting his organizational and administrative skills, historians have praised Forrestal for rejuvenating America's two-ocean Navy during the war. He wasn't one to stay behind a desk. He actually toured the Pacific Theater twice and came under enemy fire both times. The Forrestal home is located at 60 Fishkill Avenue. It has a historic marker in front of it. Everybody know where that is, right? The old high school, come down the block, right, 2 houses down. There, the parents, James and Mary Toohey Forrestal, raised the 3 Forrestal brothers. Vincent, James Vincent, the youngest, in the picture here that you see, the little guy in white in the middle, Henry and William. The Forrestal Company, which their father ran, built many of the homes on the south side of Main Street, especially what's now Rombout Avenue. And sadly, most of you may know the story of how his life ended in great tragedy. He committed suicide at the Bethesda Naval Hospital. He'd entered the hospital 3 weeks before. Probably we would call it post-traumatic stress syndrome of what he had lived through, trying to take a country that did not have a manufacturing capability to win a world war and turning it overnight through his sheer force of will into an economy that could build the things that we needed to beat the Axis forces. So he jumped out of a window, the 16th floor, and killed himself. Doctors believed his mental illness had been brought on by the stress of 9 years public service during World War II and the start of the Cold War. Forrestal's funeral a few days later at Arlington Cemetery was declared a national day of mourning by President Harry Truman. Honorary pallbearers for this man, born in Beacon, New York. He's holding the ball in the figure on the right, and he's graduating from high school here in Beacon. His pallbearers at Arlington National Cemetery include former President Herbert Hoover, Secretary of State George C. Marshall, and General of the Army Dwight D. Eisenhower. Pretty important stuff. Now, let me tell you a little bit about this father and son combination. On the left is actually the son, William Kent. He's born 1802, and he's the son of this noted jurist, James Kent, on the right. Sources differ whether William was born in New York City or Albany. We know he graduates from Union College with a BA and an MA in 1823. He's going to study law, he's going to practice in New York City, and he's appointed a judge on the circuit court by Governor Seward. He's going to resign that post, though, to accept the Royal Professorship at Harvard, which he's going to hold for 2 years, but he's going to resign that post and come back to New York, and he's going to help found New York University Law School. This gentleman is going to purchase the big estate on the left-hand side, where today is the office for the Beacon City School District. On Sargent Avenue, everybody know where that building is? The big mansion that was there that he owned, called Beaconside, was torn down by the Marianis brothers who owned the property in the 1950s. But he's a successful lawyer and actually has one of the most magnificent homes in the Hudson River Valley on that particular site. As I said, he's the son of Chancellor Kent. We're kind of famous in legal circles, if you don't know it, because James Kent is buried here in our community. He is considered the father of American jurisprudence, the William Blackstone of America, if you will. We think he's buried here only because William lived here and had that substantial estate here. A little bit about James. He's educated at Yale. He serves in the state assembly. In 1793 becomes Columbia's very first law professor. He's again elected to the assembly. Then he's appointed a justice of the state Supreme Court. He becomes chief justice in 1804, serves to 1814 when he is appointed something called the chancellor of the New York Court of Chancery. We don't really recognize what that is now. But in New York's earliest years, for decades, there was one sole pinnacle source of law, and that was the Chancellor of the State of New York. There was no other court that you appealed to. You appealed to the Chancellor, and he's the last man to hold that position. You would think that would be reason enough to remember him in history, but no. After he retires from the bench in 1823, he resumes teaching, and he becomes America's first legal scholar. His Columbia lectures are the basis for his book called Commentaries on American Law. It was, in the 1800s and early 1900s, the most common legal reference book used in this country. He begins the practice of having judges prepare written opinions when rendering decisions so that they can advance what's called equity jurisprudence. It means having a body of written decisions and opinions to use when interpreting the law, ensuring a uniform standard between jurisdictions over time. Otherwise, imagine a judge here interprets something one way, one interprets it another way. This is the first book that actually lays out the rationale for these decisions. Chancellor Kent Professorship and Columbia's Kent Hall are named for him. The New York towns of Kent and Port Kent are named for him, as is Kent County, Michigan. He's buried in St. Luke's Cemetery, and if you ever have a chance to tour the Senate wing at the New York Capitol, he is included overhead in one of the murals there, James Kent, and he is buried in St. Luke's Cemetery. Also buried in St. Luke's Cemetery are three members of the Davies family. On the left is Charles Davy, a professor of mathematics. Oh my God, I gotta hurry up, I'm sorry. At the United States Military Academy, notable for writing mathematical textbooks, elements of geometry and trigonometry was his most, I'm sure it was a little light work, right? Appeared in 33 editions, sold more than 300,000 copies. By 1875, his publisher has sold 7 million copies of his books. At least 8 were used as textbooks at West Point. His estate, which was essentially across the street from Forest Heights, Cerro Gordo, is named after his very good friend, General Winfield Scott, over a Mexican victory that he had. Nearby lives his brother, Henry Ebenezer Davies. He's chief judge of the New York Court of Appeals. He's a partner of William Kent, who we just saw, and he's a friend of Millard Fillmore, is his confidential advisor during his term as president. And then on the right is his son, one of our community's highest-ranking officers during the Civil War, Brigadier General Henry Eugene Davies. At the outbreak of the war, he's a lawyer here in Mattawan, but he enlists in the 5th New York Volunteer Infantry, becomes one of General Phil Sheridan's most trusted officers. He's going to take part in 40 different battles. He's going to have 15 horses shot out from underneath him. After the war, what's he going to do? He's going to return to Mattawan and back to his law practice, but he also, later in life, decides to write, and he writes the comprehensive biography of General Phil Sheridan, a book that's still referred to by Civil War historians. We had so many local citizens involved on local, state, and national levels in political posts. James Mackin on the left lived in Fishkill Landing. He was appointed postmaster of Fishkill during the presidency of Zachary Taylor. He was supervisor of the town of Fishkill. He was chairman of the board of supervisors for Dutchess County, member of the New York State Assembly, later the state senate, president of our village of Fishkill Landing. He was New York State treasurer from 1878 to 79, and president of the First National Bank of Fishkill Landing. To his right is a man named Morrick Hoyt, who didn't die till 1953. He was a Beacon newspaper man, a public office holder, a local historian. When he was in his 80s, he starts to write a column called Turning Back the Clock about his reminiscences of old Beacon, and we still refer to his work quite a bit. He ends up being a confidant and friend of President Roosevelt. He had launched one of his early campaigns here for him, and Franklin Roosevelt believed that that was a good luck charm for him, so he would often come to Bank Square and Beacon to launch his campaigns. They wrote to each other back and forth. February 28, 1945, FDR returns from the Yalta Conference, and he sends this letter to Morrick Hoyt. Now that I have returned from my trip overseas, I can tell you I received a real thrill from your letter of January 25th. Those were the good old days. You'll recall the 1910 campaign, the Sheehan fight, and all the other things that make life interesting. As you well observed, those tranquil days are a far cry from the president, but the comparison helps us to see things in their due proportion. I still say, this is FDR, thank God for the old days and old and tried friends like you, Morg. So he's an important part of one of the most influential, important presidents of the last century. Let's talk a little bit about some of the civic leaders. On the left is Willard H. Mays, who owned, some of you might even still call it Mays Hat Shop, is the old Mattawan Manufacturing where Roundhouse is today, second only to Tompkins Hose. But Louis Tompkins sticks primarily with his hat business. Willard Mays becomes more than that. He's going to serve 7 years as our representative in the New York State Assembly. He's the man credited with bringing the Mattawan State Hospital for the criminally insane here. With it, a lot of jobs and a lot of economic benefit. He's going to die a week apart from his rival, Louis Tompkins. And on the right, some of you may recognize this gentleman. Well-known family in Beacon, the Rosas. This is Ben Rosa. The family had owned a furniture store on Main Street here for more than a century. Ben was our New York State Assemblyman. He sponsored legislation to save the property at Stony Kill. He joined his father's law practice in 1957, was later joined by his daughter Elizabeth. She continues to operate Rosa & Rosa, which has been in business since 1927. It's the second oldest business on Main Street. Who knows the oldest business on Main Street? The Alps, good, 1922. And of course, we've also had our fair share of people who have served in Congress from here. Abraham Schenck, he's going to be marrying into a descendant of Madam Brett. He's a member of the New York State Assembly. He's elected to Congress when James Madison is president. His nephew was Isaac Teller, one of 7 children
born to Isaac DePeister Teller and Alice Skank at the Brett homestead. He's going to serve the 18th district here from 1854 to 1855 when Franklin Pierce is president. In time, after he leaves the public service, he comes back here to what was his farm. That's what he considered it. And he dies of a heart attack one day when he's out on his buggy, and they find him dead from a heart attack. He was 69 years old. And of course, Mark Molinaro, who's the current member of Congress, doesn't represent the city of Beacon, I don't believe, but Dutchess County Legislature, New York Assembly before that, county executive, youngest mayor in the United States when he's elected mayor of Tivoli. But you may not know it, he lived here in Beacon. On Roundtree Court from 1980 until 1989, after his parents went through a divorce. Here's another gentleman, Wallace Conkling, born here in 1896. He's going to receive his undergraduate degree from Williams College, his divinity degree from Philadelphia Divinity School, and a master's from Oxford in England. He is named the Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Chicago, one of the most important positions in the church. He was lifelong friends with James Forrestal. They attended school together. In fact, this man, whose name was Wallace E. Conkling, presided over Forrestal's funeral services at Arlington National Cemetery. Want to spend some time talking about Maddie Cooper. You may know that name from the block that bears her name. She was born in Georgia in 1891. She's the youngest of 21 children. Her family moves and they become members of the Springfield Baptist Church down in Georgia. At the age of 18, she tells her father, the Lord has called her to preach. And soon, even though she's only like 18, she starts traveling the Eastern Seaboard preaching. By 1914, she comes to New York City. She meets and marries a man named Edward Cooper. She's going to graduate from the Coleman Bible Institute in New York City and the Peck Bible School in Detroit. She receives her bachelor and doctoral degrees from Temple Theological College, and she becomes only the second black woman in the state of New York to become a Baptist minister when she's ordained way back in 1925. In 1945, she and her husband opened their first ministry on Beekman Street. In 1970, this woman, Reverend Maddie Cooper, goes on a holy mission around the world to places like Tokyo, Hong Kong, and Tel Aviv. She crosses the River Jordan and she meets Pope John Paul II. When she returns, she has a dream that she needs to find a new home for the Springfield Baptist Church. Urban renewal was in full swing at that time, but on Mother's Day, May 14, 1972, she marches with her congregation from Beekman Street, the former Gasworks property, to take over their new home, formerly the Trinity Methodist Church. So that was her original church there, the old Gasworks, and she had a dream that they needed to have this new home, and they got it. So she's a remarkable person. And of course, we have to talk about our favorite mayor at the time, served from 1990 to 2007, making her the longest serving female mayor in New York State history, and of course our only female mayor. She helped steer this city back to prominence, right? President of the Garden Club, district director for the Garden Club. She established Beacon as a tree city, institutes a civic beautification program, organizes the Greenway Trail, attracts DIA, founding member of the Patriots Garden, active member of the Beacon Historical Society, and she's still going strong, I think. She just had her birthday in August. I went to the dinner. Do you remember how old she was? 94, 95? We had a dinner for her at Brothers. So, and before we leave this category, I just want to tell you a little bit about this woman, Amy Sargent. She was born in France. She married Winthrop Sargent, who we'll discuss in a moment, and she made her beloved summer home at the Sargent Estate, Wodeneath. In Beacon, though, she founds and she supports what's called the Sargent Industrial School for Girls, where 3 generations of local girls are going to learn homemaking skills. Kind of like home ec programs, but more so, these are largely for the children of immigrants who are coming here so that their children can have gainful employment in homes as servants and the like. 6 classes a day there: cookery, dressmaking, sewing, 60 girls, and beginning sewing alone. The older girls went to class from 7:30 at night until 10 o'clock. There weren't any kind of fees, but there was a waiting list, and she continued it until she died in 1918, and then it was put out of business. Okay, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some heroes in our midst. We have so many veterans, so many deserving folks, so I thought I would just touch on 3 for whom our local veterans organizations are named. On the left, William B. Wilson, the first soldier from Beacon to die in World War I. He's killed by shell fire in 1918 on Belgium. He volunteers to go out into the no man's zone and to retrieve the body of his best friend, Herb Miller from Newburgh. Wilson Street in Beacon is named in his honor. Word of his death is going to reach here in Beacon by September. Best friends died on the same day, the only 2 soldiers from that unit to be killed that day. He's brought back here to be buried at St. Joachim Cemetery, and Beacon veterans are going to form a new VFW post and call it the Private William B. Wilson Post. In the middle is John Bump, just 24 years old when he's killed on October 20th, 1918, the last soldier from Company L of Newburgh to be killed in the Great War. He dies from shrapnel wounds while trying to recover from rescuing a wounded comrade, not unlike what William B. Wilson died from. His parents live on South Elm Street. His body was returned to Beacon from France along with his compatriots. Funerals were held for them. All ex-servicemen came in uniform. All 3 fire companies came. Mattawan State employees came. He was buried April the 10th with full military honors at St. Luke's, and the John J. Bump Auxiliary of Wilson is named after him. And then on February the 1st, 1944, Carmen Anthony Ramputi, just 19, isn't he so handsome? Look at him there. Fighting the Japanese with the 4th Marine Division, is killed during the invasion of Roy and Namor Islands and the Marshalls Group in the Pacific Theater. The announcement comes with the same, and is printed in the newspaper with the last letter that he wrote to his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alfonso Ramputi of 109 Verplanck Avenue. He'd enlisted in the Marine Corps, pleading with his mother to sign his papers. He said, quote, "This is my country. I do not want to be drafted. This country is worth fighting for." In 1947, Carmen's body was returned to Beacon for burial in St. Joachim Cemetery with full military honors, and the Marine Detachment is named in his honor. Let's also talk about Robert Kramer, the only volunteer fireman to ever die in the line of duty here. He was the current president of Hopkins Hose Company when he rushes into a building, 144 to 146 Main Street, on a January morning in 1955. Today, I believe that's the Beacon Outfitters. Is 144, right in that vicinity. At the time, it was a 3-story building with 2 businesses on the floor and apartments up top. Investigators believe Kramer is going to run into that building because there's a family that lives in there that has 7 children. He doesn't know that the police have already evacuated all the people out of the building. He's a pharmacist at Neary's drugstore. He is overcome by smoke inhalation. He's the only Beacon fireman to ever die in the line of duty death. And he leaves his wife, Margaret, and 2 young children, John and Mary. And some of you may know his daughter, Mary. It's Mary Wassey. Okay. We have 2 police officers who died in the line of duty. August the 14th, 1922, Charlie Lucy, who's on the left-hand side, became the first to be killed. He's going to respond to a routine call for help, and it's going to be somebody he knows. Willie White has been a figure here. He's maybe not in trouble all the time, but he's just kind of a local character. Everybody knows him. Maybe he has some mental issues that we would better diagnose today, but this is 1922. So he's called to Willie White's house on North Street in a home that's still standing there. Earlier, neighbors said they had heard Willie arguing with the doctor about having killed his father, who had died the year before. Regardless, Officer Lucy responds, and he is shot in the face at close range with both barrels of a shotgun. He's going to die at Highland Hospital afterward. Thousands of Beacon residents, from the city council to local school children, will attend his funeral. His fellow officers will provide a wreath of Lucy's badge number 16. And then Joe Dardis on the right had been a member of Beacon's very first police department, 1913, when the city is formed, although he had actually even joined the force earlier, the village of Mattawan, 1910. So by 1944, he's 72 years old. Long overdue for retirement, but he's going to stay on active duty in World War II because they have a manpower shortage. July of 1944, he's going to collapse and die of a heart attack at the Beacon Police Station after he assists in the arrest of a sailor who was wanted for desertion from the Navy. Here are 2 other heroes. Born in Albany in 1934, Navy Commander Barbara Miller grew up in Beacon with her parents on Dutchess Terrace. John, you know them, right? Barbara Miller? Grew up near you, right? She spent 20 years as a U.S. Navy nurse, starting her military career at the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda. She becomes the first woman inducted into the Connecticut Veterans Hall of Fame for her service work, which is exemplary. And on the right is Anne Elizabeth Rondeau, who is a retired United States Navy Vice Admiral. She is a native of San Antonio, Texas, but she grew up here in Beacon. Does anybody know her or recognize her? You do? Okay. During her tenure in the Navy, she received 2 Defense Distinguished Service Medals, the Navy Distinguished Service Medal, and 4 Legion of Merit Awards. She was the president of National Defense University and was chosen by the U.S. Secretary of the Navy to be president of the Naval Postgraduate School back in 2019, and that term will actually expire in January. Let's talk a little bit about medicine and academia. Dr. Egbert Guernsey was a journalist, a philanthropist, founder of 2 hospitals. He was New York's most noted doctor of homeopathy. He had a busy Fifth Avenue practice. He was the hottest, coolest, right, whatever the vogue term was for homeopathy at the time. But his respite was his large summer home here on 12 acres in Fishkill. And of course, all of you have come to my presentations before, recognize this lovely home as sometimes called the Brinkerhoff House. It's where the Forrestal Heights is located. It had become an apartment building and was taken down during urban renewal. But he weighed 400 pounds, and so he was quite a sight when people would see him driving around in his carriage. Also, Dr. Slocum, the Howland Estate, Tyrone, became Craig House Hospital. It was America's first privately licensed psychiatric hospital founded by this man. He trained in Scotland, where he trained was also called Craig House. That's where the name comes from. He and later his son Jonathan, who some of us may still remember, believed that patients could be cured with intensive talk, with fine dining, with recreational activities such as swimming and golf and cross-country, skiing, swimming, music, and ceramics. For decades, and I cannot overemphasize this, for decades, this was America's premier psychiatric facility. Premier. So many famous people were here. They do have privacy restraints on what you can share and what you can't, but it is well known that Frances Seymour, wife to Henry Fonda and mother of Jane Fonda, committed suicide here. Rosemary Kennedy was sent here after her controversial lobotomy when she was just 23 years old. But many other famous people. Zelda Fitzgerald was treated here. Jackie Gleason was treated here. So many, many people came to this establishment. Let's talk a little bit about Jacob Levy Moreno, Romanian-American, got to read this one, psychiatrist, psychosociologist, and educator, the founder of psychodrama and the foremost pioneer of group psychotherapy. During his lifetime, he was recognized as one of the world's leading social sciences. Right after World War I in Vienna, which is where he's from, he's going to embark on an experiment, something he calls the theater of spontaneity, which employed actors and actresses to participate in a new form of entertainment that grew out of improvisations based on cues from the audience. The experiment evolved into psychodrama, a technique that hundreds of hospitals in the United States and around the world subsequently adopted to treat their patients. In 1936, he's going to open the Beacon Hill Sanitarium, later renamed the Moreno Sanitarium or Moreno Institute on Walcott Avenue, and Professor Davies, the West Point professor's house, Cerro Gordo, which was really across the street from the Forrestal Heights. Group therapy, psychodrama approaches. He's going to die there in the house in 1974. He's best known for his research, wrong person, sorry. He does die there in 1940. His ashes are buried in Vienna, and at his request, his epitaph reads, quote, "The man who brought joy and laughter to psychiatry. And then if we look here, that's where he was born in Vienna with a historic marker on it. This is his son, Jonathan Moreno, who's a Beacon High School graduate, American philosopher and historian whose biography states he specializes in the intersection of bioethics, culture, science, and national security. He's published more than 1,000 papers, articles, reviews, and op-eds that have been translated into German, Japanese, Korean, Portuguese, Turkish, and Romanian. Let's talk a little bit on the left about David E. Cummings, born here in 1935, an American medical geneticist, former chief of genetics at the City of Hope National Medical Center in Duarte, California, a position he held from 1966 until his retirement in 2002. He served as the president of the American Society of Human Genetics and editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Human Genetics. He's best known for his groundbreaking research on the genetics of Tourette's syndrome. So does anybody recognize him? Anybody go to school with him or know him? Okay. On the right is David Van Slyke, an American academic, the dean of the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University, a leading international expert on public-private partnerships, public sector contracting, contract management, public and nonprofit management, and policy and implementation. And he has worked in China and India and Russia and Singapore and Thailand, all these places on international business projects. And his parents still live in their lovely home on Verplanck Avenue, right? Jerry and Diane. And they're just great people, and this is their son. So we should be very proud of him and the Van Slikes. Okay, my last category, I know you're all happy for that. Okay, James Brown. We don't have an image of James Brown, but this is a mural from the Howland Public Library of this man who was an escaped slave and became a gardener at the Verplanck House at Mount Gulliam. He kept a journal from 1829 until 1960. Excuse me, that'd be a long time. 1829 to 1860, so 31 years. His passion besides his garden was observing the weather and natural phenomenon. For example, March of 1843, he writes he sees something curious in the sky, like the tail of a comet. What he saw was the famous comet of 1843, whose brilliant 200-mile tail suddenly appeared in the sky in February and March of 1843. Excerpts from his diary were first printed in installments in 1895 editions of the Fishkill Standards. His diary reveals deep feelings for patriotism. He's desire to earn money so he can buy property, to vote in elections. He's very involved in the church. He helps to found the first African-American burial ground here. He makes enough money to buy his wife and bring her here. He too is buried in St. Luke's Cemetery, and just a few years ago, the Historical Society cooperated with some other organizations and actually had that headstone repaired. Next is a woman named Phoebe Dowdy. She was the first female physician in Beacon. She was the daughter of a physician, a Civil War physician, Dr. John Henry Dowdy of Mattawan. She graduates from Vassar College with honors in 1895, and she thinks she's going to go off and be a teacher. But her brother, who was going to follow in the father's footsteps, suddenly dies. And so Phoebe decides instead to attend the University of Michigan, as her father and her brother had done before her, and she passes her medical examinations. In October of 1904, she hangs out her shingle to practice medicine on 27 Skank Avenue here in Mattawan. She becomes our first female doctor. She's going to continue her practice into her 80s. She's not going to die until 1967 when she's 93 years old. And I'm happy to say that we actually own literally her shingle at the Beacon Historical Society. Her nephew gave it to us. Let's talk a little bit about our neighbors, the Howlands. Joseph was born in New York City, 1834, a very comfortable, well-to-do family. He's a descendant of a signer of the Mayflower Compact. He's a Mayflower descendant. Comes to our area and purchases a farm in 1859. He's going to make that home into a place of beauty. We know it today as the Craig House Hospital main building. The Howlands themselves called the Tyranda, a Native American word associated with the place. He almost immediately is off to the Civil War. At the outbreak of hostilities, he becomes a brigade chief at Gaines Mill. He is wounded. He's breveted a brigadier general, but his wounds and his delicate constitutions dictate that he comes home from military service. But he doesn't stop serving at that point. He becomes New York State Treasurer for 2 years. He founds Cornell University. He's an organizer of the Hudson River State Hospital, of Tyranda School, of the Howland Library, the Presbyterian Church, the Mechanic Savings Bank, Highland Hospital. His name is honored by his fellow veterans from the Howland Post of the Grand Army of the Republic, the Civil War vets. He's going to go to France to try to regain his health, and unfortunately, he's going to die there. His wife, meanwhile, she too had come from a prominent New York family, and she'd married when she was only 19 years old. But again, just as the Civil War is breaking out, they're going to settle into their new house, which is being finished. Nonetheless, she and her sisters become involved in what's called the U.S. Sanitary Commission. This is what women are going to do to help their men who are away fighting, make sure that battlefield conditions are as sanitary as possible. One of the military camps in Washington, D.C. was named Camp Woolsey in recognition of her family's devotion and loyalty to the cause. They received state and national honors for what these women did during the American Civil War. So after the Civil War ends, the Howlands are going to spend 20 years at Tyranda, the beautiful Craig House building. But after he dies, she can't come back to the estate. It's too painful for her to return to this place they had built together. They had so many wonderful memories. She's going to die in 1908 at her summer home in Newport, Rhode Island. And what does she do before she dies? She offers that beautiful home, the Craig House property, with all of its acreage to the village of Mattywan for a village hall. But they turn it down. So that's how it ends up going into the hands of Dr. Slocum. Can't leave a talk about Beaconites to remember without talking about the Sargent family. Here's Henry Winthrop Sargent, the father in this picture. He'd been born into a comfortable life in Boston, educated at Boston Latin School and Harvard College. 1841, he retires and moves to Wodeneth, an estate of, at the time, about 20 acres here in Fishkill Landing. It would be called by one leading national magazine the most beautiful 20 acres in America, because he turns it into a landscaping showcase. In addition to that, it has these beautiful views of the mountain and the river. He's an early friend of the great landscape gardener, the father of American landscape architecture, Andrew Jackson Downing, from whom he designed his earliest lessons, but he also edits Downing's work for him. His son, who's in this picture, is going to inherit the estate after he passes away. Let's talk for just a moment about Emily Denning Van Rensselaer. She grew up on one of our grandest estates, Presqu'île, which in French means almost an island, and you know it as Denning's Point. She used her family's wealth. She never married, and she used her wealth to do charitable work. She was active in the Women's Christian Temperance Unit movement and the Seventh-day Adventist Church. She donated a community building in Mattywan for a free reading room to become the headquarters of the Temperance Union. Although she was later eulogized as a friend to mankind and she gave away almost all of her fortune, her real claim to fame in Beacon is that she was the very first person here to own a car. A car. Yes. They're not related to me, but I got two quick Van Buren notes to shout out here. On the left-hand side is the headstone, because we don't have an image of him, of a man named Smith Van Buren, son of President Martin Van Buren. He had moved here from Kinderhook, his father's home, to Edge Hill off of Neville's Avenue today. It too is going to be subsumed into that Marianist property when they have the Marianist Preparatory School here. He's trained as a lawyer, but he never really practices law. He's kind of his father's confidant. He marries the niece of Washington Irving, and they move here and have this beautiful estate. The Fishkill Standard says when he dies, many will mourn and all will regret the loss of the accomplished gentleman, an honest and upright citizen. So we have the son of a United States president buried here at St. Luke's. And on the right-hand side is a really interesting man, and I could do a whole presentation on him, but he is born here in Fishkill Landing. His name is Willis Van Buren. He enters the Civil War. He's in service, and he has the great misfortune of being captured and brought to a place called Andersonville. And he is going to be one of the prisoners who survive Andersonville, and he is going to go on to testify at the only hearing of its kind after the Civil War about the treatment that the men received at Andersonville. Of course, it had been built to hold 10,000 men, but by August of 1864, it held over 30,000. More than 1 out of 3 prisoners would die here. Somehow Willis found the determination to survive. Quote, "The men have frozen, starved, and been murdered at my side by the thousands," he wrote his parents here in Fishkill Landing, "and yet somehow I have been spared." Captain Henry Wirtz, commander of the prison, was blamed for it. And this is Van Buren again. "The prisoners, while I was there, were supplied rations very irregularly. I have seen men in starving condition. I saw skeletons, men with flesh all off their bones, lying and standing around, some partially covered with blankets, some nearly naked. I frequently saw the men hunting around the sinks," which is the word for toilets, around the sinks for food that had once passed through men's bodies. This place seemed a perfect hell on earth. So thanks in part to his testimony, Captain Wirtz was the only Confederate who was found guilty, hanged, and executed after the war for his war crimes. He does return to Fishkill Landing, but he kind of has, poor health. You can understand why for the rest of his life. He does receive a pension, and that's what he lives off of the rest of his life. Here are 3 different faces of America that you would have found here in Beacon. On the left, Sam Beskin, who lived the American dream by becoming a successful merchant and our city's second mayor. It was a rags to riches story. He emigrated from Russia to Fishkill Landing in 1894. He was just a peddler who sold things off a cart in the street. But in a few years, he saved up enough money to buy a hotel. Then he built a bottling works. clothing house and his department store on Bank Square. He also owned an apartment building. Mixed in with all those holdings and business dealings, he did find time to be our second mayor. Later, he was a road contractor for New York State. Upon learning of Beskin's sudden death in 1924, Beacon Mayor Irving Stafford wrote, quote, "Coming to the city about 28 years ago as a poor Russian immigrant without knowledge of the English language and our ways and customs, he started to make a name for himself, and by hard, persevering and intelligent work, he became one of our leading citizens." So that's a great immigrant success story. In the middle is another, Mike Spino, came here in 1913 when we became a city. The local newspaper put out a special edition. It had things like the incline and the trolley and the ferry on the cover, and it chose one representative citizen to talk about, and that was Mike Spino. Such was the esteem that the city had for him. He'd come to the city about 15 years earlier, but he became a respected local contractor here whose Italian workers would end up digging the ditches for our first sewers. They would grade most of our roads. They would lay the masonry foundations for many of our buildings. He becomes considered the spokesperson for the Italian community, and he often acts as an interpreter for his fellow citizens in local courts. But his lasting legacy may be St. Rocco's Hall on South Chestnut Street, constructed in 1927 under his supervision on land that he donated for the project. When he died in 1946, the Beacon News wrote, "Death has removed one of Beacon's leading Italian-American citizens. Although he was Italian by birth, Michael Spino became a staunch American in his long years of residence here. He was a community leader, particularly influential among the residents of Italian ancestry, and hundreds of his friends throughout the city will mourn his passing." And on the right, I included this because we have so many photographs of unknown people, so please go home with a light lead pencil right on the back of hard copy photos, who's in it and about what year it is and maybe where they are. Or if it's an electronic file, save it with the names of the people and where they are and what year it is, right? This is a photograph that's in our collection, and it is a complete mystery to me. It was included in a scrapbook that we received from a family named the Dotzerts, D-O-T-Z-E-R-T. They were a Caucasian family, and on the back page of one of the pages is this photograph of this lovely, lovely African-American woman. We have no idea who she was. Was she a celebrity, a family friend, a servant? We don't know, and I kind of just wanted to put her in here to represent all of the Beaconites whose identities will forever remain unknown to us. Just a few more to go, folks. 4. I'm sorry. I could go on all night. Aren't these fascinating people? But we have to talk about Ben Hammond, who started a paint and insecticide business. Not too many boys dream when they're little being in the insecticide business, but he must have. He started on Long Dock. He would be employing 22 workers by 1906. He did do a good business locally, but most of his trade was from mail order throughout the rest of the country, including foreign countries. So they're mailing insecticides through the mail. Think about that, okay? Hammond's business success was eclipsed only by his penchant for public service. He served several terms as president of the Village of Fishkill Landing, and he was president of the Beacon Board of Education. In fact, you may recognize his name, Ben Hammond, because of what? Hammond's Field, very good, named in his honor in 1928. So in this photograph, he's the far right arrow that you see there. This is the 36 people who graduate from Beacon High School in 1925. This is a significant year for us because the year before, 1924, Hammond had retired as school board president after that he had served on 30 years as our school board president. That's the highest form of public service, folks. I don't care what year it is, but the school board president. But the class of 1925 was the first to graduate, thanks in large part to his efforts from the new high school there, which we know now as the old high school, right? But on that June evening, the mayor, Ernest McCumber, surprised Ben Hammond with an honorary diploma because he had never graduated from high school himself. That's how much he valued education. The audience applauded Hammond for a full 5 minutes. Also, Hammond got to do some more honors. The first diploma that went to Edward Todd, who had 14, he's on the far left, was the youngest to graduate. And it says the new auditorium shook with applause. So he's graduating from high school at the age of 14. And then, right in the center, so proud that the third history-making moment of the night was when William Howes was the first black to graduate from the New Beacon High School, stood on stage, and here too, thunderous applause that lasted more than 5 minutes from the audience. So this is a very important photograph because all the things that are happening in the evolution of our city. I promise just a few more. Here she is, Helen Dolson. She entered and won the Miss Mount Beacon title in mid-August of 1934, and that began for her a parade of beauty pageants for Beacon's prettiest drum majorette, leading to her nearly becoming Miss America in 1934. After Mount Beacon, she goes on to be the Mid-Hudson representative at the Miss New York finals. There, while wearing her Miss Mount Beacon sash, she is picked first from 100 contestants in the bathing suit competition and second in the evening gown competition. And then guess what? The judges were unanimous. Helen would be the new Miss Empire State. So she was Miss New York, right here from Beacon. The next stop was Boston in the Miss Atlantic States competition. The Boston arena girls from 12 other eastern states competed for the crown. The winner was going to go on to the Miss America finals. Helen was first runner-up. She had come so close to going to Atlantic City, but she returns to Beacon afterward. She's going to work in a nursery school. She's going to marry a Poughkeepsie guy. And every year, this was 1934, she was in the pageants. Every year until she died in 1991, she went as an invited guest to the Miss America pageant in Atlantic City to be remembered as Miss Empire State 1934. Pretty neat, right? Next up is Dylan Wallace, a lawyer, an outdoorsman, and author of nonfiction and magazine articles. His first book was called The Lure of the Labrador, Wild, 1905. It was a bestseller, so were many of his other titles. He then joins the staff of Outing magazine, which sent him on expeditions around the world. Over the next 30 years, he's going to publish 26 more books, fiction and nonfiction. Locally, though, he's known as the Chief because he founds the very first Boy Scout troop in Dutchess County when he forms Troop 1 in Beacon. Between all those adventures that he went on all literally around the world, he did make his home in Beacon, and he came back here. He first lived in a little small cottage on St. Luke's Place, you know, near the church there, but then later he relocated to 101 Union Street. Proud that the 101 Union Street folks who own the house now just put one of our new Beacon Historical Society historic property markers on it. If you saw it on Facebook, it's a beautiful house, kitty corner from the Green Street Park. And so he dies, he's going to die here in 1939. Okay, whew, all right, Chris, bring it home. All right, I saved the best for last. Because I'm going to tell you, I want you to look for the program that we had on this man's life that is on our website. Harry Van Tyne, who you see on the left, who I believe is third from the left in the photo outside the White House, is a Beacon native. His father owns Van Tyne Stationery on Lower Main Street. Some of you may recognize that name. But he's also one of the founders of the White House News Photographer Association. He learned his craft of photography right here in the villages of Mattawan and Fishkin Landing, and later the city of Beacon. He would take, for example, photographs of the Mount Beacon incline that would be turned into postcards that were sold all over the world. He started his official formal career in 1904 as a reporter and a photographer for local newspapers. By 1915, he opens a field office in Washington, D.C. for International News Photo. Spanning 6 decades, Van Tyne would work as a reporter and a photographer, traveling throughout North America and Europe. This man was a witness and captured on film presidents, kings, queens, even criminals like Harry K. Thaw, famous people of his day, all were captured by this Beacon native, Harry Van Tyne. And as I said, if you go onto our website, you'll be able to see a very wonderful presentation done by Diane Lapis, who's our Director of Special Projects at the Historical Society, who really researched his life and can tell you much more about all the amazing experiences that he had. And so the time now, I'm going to just read one last thing and we're done at 8:30. This was scandalously long. For those of you who came to other installments, I tried to keep them to an hour, but I was too excited tonight because it's the last one. I'm sorry. Okay, so if you'll forgive me, and then we'll do our door prizes. Chris, if you want to get you can turn the lights up and get the raffle tickets, because the folks who came in late need their little door prize ticket. So I just wanted to finish with something that I think certainly can be updated for the current day and the current face of Beacon, if you will, but something I think that speaks to the very essence of being a person from Beacon that was delivered by James Forrestal. So just bear with me for one moment. I'm going to read a portion of one of the speeches he gave here. On October the 18th, 1943, Under Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal made a long overdue return to his hometown of Beacon. The occasion was the presentation of the Army-Navy E-Production Award, that's the Excellence Award, to the employees of the New York Rubber Company in their factory on Tioronda Avenue. For those of those of you who don't know, they were making a lot of rubber life rafts and other things for the war effort. For Forrestal, who would go on to become our first Secretary of Defense, it was a rare opportunity to reveal his thoughts about Beacon. And here's just one excerpt from that speech. I am glad to get back to Beacon for this award because it is a healthy thing for bureaucrats to come back to their origins and get a reminder that the roots of government in our country lie in communities such as these. Beacon and Dutchess County are as good an example as there is of what constitutes American life. We live in a valley richly endowed with traditions of our country's beginning. The names of Washington, Hamilton, Schuyler, Verplanck, Roosevelt, and Chancellor Livingston are great names in the history of our country and our community. At the same time, this city and county are representative of the amalgam of peoples which has given this nation extraordinary growth and world power within a century. Both have in them the descendants of immigrants of English, Scotch, and Irish extraction, or of German, Dutch, Italian, Polish, Czech, and Balkan ancestry. And of course, today we can add so many other nationalities. It's James Forrestal. I am proud of the fact that in this town, the sons and daughters of these immigrants went to school together, played games together with children of older origins without thoughts of bigotry, of bias, or prejudice. There were and probably still are the jealousies and animosities which are part of the normal complexity of human relationships. But broadly speaking, the individual of this community, whether a descendant of Dutch patroons, of the English colonials, or the recently arrived immigrant, stood on his own feet and was judged in his individual by his own merits and his own character. And this is how he concluded. That is the Beacon in which boys of our generation grew up, and I suspect is still the Beacon of today. There were Cornishmen like Henry Corney, Scotchmen like William Graham, Irishmen like John Mara, Jews like Sam Beskin and David Alper, and men like my father and Edward St. John, all of whom had a deep sense of community responsibility and did their best to discharge it. So I hope tonight's presentation captured some of those people, right, that had that same sense of community. Thank you so much for your attention.